Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming on Green Key Weekend. We here are offering sustenance for the mind rather than other things, libations that are being offered on other places on this campus right now. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and very, very happy to welcome you here. This is going to be a very interesting and a very important subject that will be covered. I just simply wanted to use this opportunity to thank our two speakers, Ed Luck and Ambassador Emyr Parry Parry, who have, the ambassador has been with us all week as our class of 1950 fellow, and along with his wonderful wife, Lynn, who's here. And it's just been a wonderful time, and I just wanted to just say my thanks to the both of you for coming. It's been a real pleasure to have you. But to formally introduce the program today, I'm very pleased and honored to invite Professor, Gene Lyons, something went down the wrong pipe there. Professor Gene Lyons, who is a professor emeritus of government, and a very distinguished member of our Dickey Center family. We love having him. He comes and writes and blesses us with his presence with a lot of wisdom and a lot of good information. His background, his area of specialty really was, the UN, multilateral relations. So we thought it would be really a wonderful thing if Gene could introduce the panel today and conduct the program. So, Gene, over to you, sir, and thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I thought I would start by recalling another project of the Dickey Center. It was about more than 15 years ago that Dr. Jim Strickler, the former dean of the medical school, came back from Sudan. And he'd been there for the International Rescue Committee, which he was very active in. And he came in and he said, by the way, what's this thing called sovereignty? Well, asking a couple of political scientists about sovereignty is like my asking a doctor, tell me about diabetes, or tell me about cancer, or tell me about something like that. You go, well, we did what the doctors would do. We held a conference. This is what academics do. We invited 40 people and had a conference, and then we wrote a book. And Mike Restitute and I edited a book called Beyond Westphalia, State Sovereignty and International Intervention. And that's, in point of fact, what this session is all about. Because more than 20 years ago, Ed might recall this, the then Secretary General, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, made a speech, I think, in Bordeaux, in which he said, we've got a real dilemma. Because sovereignty is a basic principle of international politics, that each country is sovereign over its territory and its people, and others cannot intervene. And that's very positive, because it means that the big cannot sort of invade without thinking the small. So it's a protection against of the small countries. But he said we now have situations where we should intervene into countries where there are refugees, where there's humanitarian aid. And in the Sudan, the problem that Jim Strickler was finding is that IRC wanted to offer aid of a variety of different kinds, and the Sudanese government was putting conditions on it and wouldn't let them do it. So that's the problem. And now some of you may recognize that this is still happening in the Sudan. And as a matter of fact, there's a peacekeeping force in the Sudan, and when the Security Council wanted to increase the number and the composition of that force, well, the Sudanese government would not agree. And so the Security Council, even after they agreed, could not move forward. And as a matter of fact, now when we have these calamities, these natural calamities in Myanmar or Burma, much easier to say, and in Burma, there's a lot of talk about the Burmese government not permitting humanitarian aid to come in. So we're stuck with that problem. Now, what has evolved over time is that a number of scholars and policymakers have evolved the concept of responsibility to protect. Now, if the principle of responsibility to protect can become part of the guidance, a guiding pole, for example, for international intervention, then the international community, whether through the UN or through NATO or through the European Union or through ASEAN, would have the right to intervene into a situation where it legitimately concluded that there was a need for the international community to do so, because people's rights or people's lives were at stake. And that's what this is all about. But today we're going to concentrate on the issue of the Kosovo, how this idea, this problem came to bear in the case of Kosovo. Now, we've got two speakers, and I'm going to introduce both of them now, and then they can go on, and I don't have to interrupt. The first, I think that Ken Yelowitz already mentioned, is Ambassador Jones Parry has been here all week, and he knows the place. He knows all the restaurants. He knows all the bars. I remember once I invited him.
In that order.
And we've known him, and as a matter of fact, we want to keep him. But he won't stay. He says he's got other duties because he's now the president of the University of Wales. The interesting thing about him, though, is that he started in theoretical physics, then studied polymers. When getting his degree at Cambridge, and then became a diplomat, which tells me something about the majors that some of our students are taking. Don't worry about your major. You will turn out to be something else and be very good at it. But he's been in a number of classes, and so he will write his impressions of Dartmouth when he gets home. He's the first speaker today. And our second speaker, I'm welcoming home Ed Luck of the class of 1970. I knew Ed when he was a student, and about, 20 years or so ago, we were inaugurating a project here at the Dickey Center to establish what we call the Academic Council on the United Nations System. And vaguely, I remembered that Ed had been associated with the United Nations Association in New York. And so I just dropped a note and said, by the way, you're still with the UNA because we're doing this thing on the UN? And he wrote back and said, yes, I'm still here, and I'm going to be president next week. Well, he did become president for 10 years, and we had a very fruitful time working with him and his colleagues. And now he's back to academia. He's really at Columbia, where he's the professor. Well, president, I'm thinking presidential terms these days. But he's a professor of public diplomacy and international organization and runs a center there. But he's just been taken over by the UN, and he's at the International Peace Institute as vice president, and also a special assistant to the Secretary General for, guess what, responsibility to what? To intervene. Anyway, those are our two speakers who know a lot about this subject. And first, I'll talk to our good ambassador and ask him to open the festivities.
Professor Lyons, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Ken, for the invitation. I want to make absolutely clear, Lynn and I have enjoyed it hugely. We have not spent all our time in bars or in restaurants. We have done some things seriously. And it's been a pleasure to be here. And I want you to know how much of a pleasure it's been, just in case anybody wants to, re-invite me back. You mentioned Westphalia. If you go back to the 19th century, the idea of the state, the sovereignty of the state, was everything. That's reflected in the Charter of the United Nations and in Article 2.7. Effectively, thou shalt not interfere in the domestic affairs of a sovereign state. And it is one of the tensions running through the United Nations system. When can one intervene? When is coercive action justified to protect people at risk within a member state? It's controversial when governments decide to act. It's perhaps even more controversial when they're unable or choose not to act. It's a clash between, if you like, the breach of international order, the sovereignty of a state, against the international conscience, against universal values, rights. Kofi Annan posed the question, Paris du Quellier obviously before, but what Annan said was, if to intervene is an assault on sovereignty, how do we respond to gross systematic abuse, for example, in Rwanda? And it was true then, it was true in Srebrenica, it was true in Kosovo. And we've moved a bit further forward, and we'll try and explore that this evening. But I want to take Kosovo as a specific case. Let me start with that. That Kosovo, this part of Serbia, never actually a province of the former Yugoslavia, but up until 1989, an area which had a particular legal statute, a degree of autonomy, and of course was ethnically, almost homogeneously, Kosovo Albanian. And then one of the criminals of the last 50 years, Milosevic, made a speech in Kosovo in June 1989, recalling what had happened 600 years before when the Serbs had famously been defeated on a battlefield. And that unleashed a torrent within the former Yugoslavia. The lid came off it, and what we have today are 6 sovereign, independent states where there had been one. And there is a Kosovo which is within Serbia, but the issue is whether or not that Kosovo should now become an independent state and recognized as such. But what happened post-1989, the unleashing of that conflict within the Balkans, Dayton resolved it temporarily, a huge amount of progress since. But we move fast forward to 1998, the movement for autonomy within Kosovo, and at the same time, acts of repression by the Yugoslav army, the VJ, otherwise the army based in Belgrade, and increasingly action by the Kosovo Liberation Army to try and oppose that army. It became clear to the politicians in Europe, and I went round with Tony Blair in June of 1998, the mood was simple. Milosevic this time will not be allowed to get away with it. And of course, much of that was guilt over Bosnia, guilt over what we all allowed to happen, and this sense of this time we have to try and avert the crisis. Well, in the autumn of 1998, the North Atlantic Alliance gave a formal warning to Milosevic. A warning not based on a Security Council resolution, but a clear warning from the alliance that if Milosevic didn't stop the aggression, then NATO would take military action against Yugoslavia, as it was then called, Serbia and Montenegro. In doing that, NATO took upon itself the right to press for humanitarian intervention effectively, believing, and this is the legal construct used by the British and accepted by many member states, but it has to be said that NATO had the wisdom to say, we believe we're acting legally in giving this ultimatum, but we're not going to agree a common legal position. Let everybody sort out their own impression, their own view of the legality, but the British view was simple, that we were trying to, through a diplomatic process, find a solution. That if that solution was not forthcoming, and if it became clear that there was a prospect of an immediate and an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe, then we had a responsibility to intervene, but that the means should be proportionate and should be targeted solely at tackling the problem. That was our intention, that's what we said. We took note also of the Yugoslav government's non-compliance with an earlier Security Council resolution and a warning by the then Secretary General of a prospect of a humanitarian disaster. But there was no Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force. Let me just recap very quickly. There are 3 classic cases where you can legally act to intervene in another state. The first is self-defense, if you've been attacked. Secondly, if you've been invited by that state to intervene on their territory. And thirdly, if you have a Security Council resolution. We were in different territory in the case of Kosovo. this concept of humanitarian intervention more associated with a military intervention. The question was, what should we do? 1244, that resolution adopted at the end of the subsequent military action, in a sense, justified post hoc the intervention, although Russia, of course, never accepted that. But after the warning had been given, the Rambouillet peace process took place. There was an agreement on the table between the Kosovo Albanians and the government in Belgrade, and at the end the Albanians accepted, but it was not accepted by Milosevic and his government, and a final ultimatum delivered by the British Foreign Secretary a couple of days before the military intervention made it clear that unless there were a withdrawal from Kosovo, unless the hostilities against the Albanians ceased, then there would be military action. And we know there was no change. Military action took place, and 78 days later, the NATO operation came to an end. Resolution 1244 was adopted as part of the ending of that conflict, and we then, in that resolution, foresaw the United Nations taking over effectively the sovereignty of Kosovo pro tem, that the UN would sit astride a pyramid. Below would be economic aspects run by the European Union, NATO doing defense, the institution building democracy would be run by the Council of Europe and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the various parts of the UN family would be in there taking different responsibilities. What was called UNMIC, the UN mission in Kosovo. The dilemma today is, how does that process end? And the assumption for many is that there should be a move towards managed independence. That's not accepted by Russia. And the net result has been that Kosovo has unilaterally declared independence. 40 countries today have recognized that independence, but it's not enough to assume that Kosovo is independent. And until there is a sufficient core of countries who recognize, Kosovo internationally will not be independent and therefore has no prospect of becoming a member state of the United Nations. So there's a state of limbo for Kosovo now. But that's what happened. As I said, part guilt over Bosnia, part real concern about peace and security in the region, refugees being kicked out of Kosovo on trains at Easter 1999 in a manner redolent of what the Nazis did during the war. But this attack by Milosevic, this time seen off, and partly, of course, because of his unwillingness to accept a political solution. Now, I've been talking about Kosovo, and I used the phrase humanitarian intervention. Responsibility to protect is more of the general concept and doesn't and shouldn't imply the same degree of military intervention. The Canadians in about 1999 established an international committee on international and state sovereignty, and its conclusions set out a viable doctrine, in my view, on responsibility to protect. It assumed that sovereignty was there, but that a state exercising sovereignty had obligations to its own people. But there were legal obligations in terms of human rights, treaties, international law, and that governments had a responsibility to prevent root causes of potential conflict, a responsibility to react where they were emerging, a responsibility to rebuild the situation on the ground, but that when it came down to it, if there were a just cause, a prospect of a large-scale loss of life, a risk of ethnic cleansing, then the right of intervention as a last resort, proportionate to the means that should be adopted and a reasonable prospect of success. And the Canadians said, with the right authority. And they said the best, and I agree with this, the best authority would be a decision of the Security Council, and that should be desirable before an action were taken. I move forward to September 2005 with very, very much difficulty. The World Summit in September of that year, in its outcome document, addressed responsibility to protect. And suffice to say, it was the most controversial issue right to the very end. And 5 minutes before the General Assembly was due to confirm its acceptance of the outcome document, one very large member state assured me that they would break consensus on this very issue. In the event, they didn't. It was adopted, not least because the Canadian Prime Minister of the day phoned a number of member states, as did my own Foreign Minister, to try and encourage states to rally. And what the World Summit document said was that each state has a responsibility to protect its own population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and including the prevention of such acts. Now, I did not include in that natural disasters, and I'll come back to that. But genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. But secondly, if the member state concerned was unable to exercise that authority, then the international community, through the United Nations, had the responsibility to use, and I quote now, appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, political, and peaceful means to assist the state concerned. That is, to help the state create the capacity to protect its own citizens. And what was envisaged would be action under Chapter 6 and 8 of the UN Charter, not Chapter 7. But thirdly, if the situation, notwithstanding the efforts to try and help the state, if the situation continued to be of grave concern without remedy, then the international community should be ready with a stronger response, including Chapter 7, case by case. And the significance of Chapter 7 is, with the right wording in a resolution based on Chapter 7, you can make that mandatory on every member state of the UN and authorize explicitly the use of force. That's where we've got to. And the doctrine in terms of international law has moved on slightly because of Kosovo and countries' responses to Kosovo. But it's still the case that you can find 3 lawyers in a room and one will say it's absolutely justified to intervene even if there is no Security Council resolution. You'll have another who will say it's totally illegal to do so, and you'll have the third who will sit on the fence. That's the difficulty of the issue. And politically, I know what Ed thinks, but in my view, I doubt that 40% of the membership of the United Nations has accepted, but in practice, when it comes down to it, but this principle should transcend the wishes of a member state. So there's a lot to do on the legality and very much on the politics of it. The tension remains. State sovereignty against intervention for values and for rights. And when it comes down to it in the end, it's the political will of nations. Are they willing to see action? Do they respect this hierarchy? And if the first 2 conditions have been met without success, are they prepared to see the action? And then there comes a very simple test too, which is the test of the practical. Are there countries actually prepared to do the intervention? And secondly, is it possible to make the intervention? We take Darfur as an example. It's often said, well, of course, you were prepared to intervene in Kosovo, or you intervened in Iraq, entirely different case, but you intervened on Iraq because of the oil. There's nothing in Darfur, so you're not prepared to intervene. Well, there is a practical problem about intervening in Darfur if you don't have the consent of the government in Khartoum, and that is you cannot land in the airport in Khartoum and say, excuse us, we'd like to just unload all this equipment and all these vehicles, and we're heading westwards to Darfur. You can't either come in by land and ask the Libyans, could you come ashore in Tripoli, and then 1,200 miles south later turn left and go into Darfur and hope that you can do it. The test of practicality and the test of who's willing to intervene also comes crucially into play. I hope very much that somebody asks us a question about Myanmar, because I suspect the two of us don't necessarily see that one eye to eye. But that, in essence, is the dilemma. When can we do what we should do against when can we act? When are we prepared to act? And it remains a very sensitive but vital subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed?
Thanks very much. I told Emyr that my one condition was that he speak first. And of course, he didn't leave very much left, as usual. However, I guess the other part of that condition is I get to speak last. Although he won't let me have the last word. This much we can depend on. First of all, let me very much thank Gene Lyons for being here. I don't know in what way he recalls my being a student, but I do recall that he was my undergraduate advisor. And somehow in that period I went from theoretical mathematics to international relations. So I guess he was influential in the right direction. One caveat, even though I am the Secretary General's Special Advisor in this area, today I'd like to just wear my academic hat and just speak as an individual. I think it's probably safer that way. We've had a lot of back and forth this past week about Myanmar, and at least one permanent member of the Security Council is a little unhappy with me at the moment. Let me see about the others. In any case, let me say a couple things about theory and about the Charter. And then a few things about the evolution of this, which Emyr covered very nicely, but I'd like to add a little bit to that. And then a bit about the current politics and situation with this. First of all, on the theory and the Charter, Emyr mentioned the famous Article 2.7 in the Charter, and hardly anyone quotes the last part of that, which is, yes, you don't interfere in things that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a member state, with the big exception if the Security Council is taking enforcement action. So I think that was a big hole in sovereignty way back in 1945. You look at the emphasis in the preamble and the purposes on human rights and other issues, it seems to me that, in a sense, you had a rather porous conception of sovereignty even then. And the very idea of the UN is in some ways a pooled sovereignty when it comes to security. So I don't think it was all that pure to begin with. Second of all, on the question of intervention, I think most people think of it in a coercive way. But I think that's not necessarily very helpful for this particular concept or for even our understanding of the relationship between the member states and the UN itself. Intervention is something, in my view, that the UN, regional organizations, sub-regional organizations, even many transnational civil society groups do every day. The same states that worry about sovereignty when it comes to responsibility, protect, or security are only too happy to have international intervention in their fundamental development, economic affairs, and the amount of involvement of the international community in shaping the way states grow and are managed seems to me has grown and grown over time. And much of what we're talking about, I think, really relates to good governance. And the organization is involved in all sorts of ways and trying to help states in terms of their capacity for governance. So I think if we think of intervention, it's only when we sort of get to the coercive Chapter 7 sense that people begin to have problems with it. But I think R2P, as I think Emyr suggested, but I would talk about in a little more depth, is really a continuum in this sense. And as he suggested, the military end is only one end, probably the least likely end of that continuum. Now, in terms of the evolution of this concept, I would distinguish two sort of intellectual trends. One is the humanitarian intervention one, and the other one is the one that really produced, in many ways, R2P, if I can use that acronym. Humanitarian intervention was indeed what Kofi Annan talked about in much of the 90s, some very articulate speeches in 98, 99, most famously his speeches to Ditchley in 98 and to the General Assembly in September of 1999. But humanitarian intervention sort of posed a two-part game, what I sometimes call sort of a switch, like a light switch. Either you do nothing and watch genocide or other atrocities unfold, or you think of some kind of coercive intervention, and really very little room in between. And that, to me, was really running fast up a cul-de-sac politically, because member states didn't want to choose between doing nothing or intervening militarily. And Kofi posed these as rather stark choices, but really no one wanted to pick either choice. So he ran really into a brick wall at the end of the time. It seems to me that Responsibility to Protect comes more from work that Francis Ding and his colleagues were doing at the Brookings Institution in the mid-90s about sovereignty as responsibility. That the fundamental issue is not international intervention. The fundamental issue is the core responsibility of the state. And why were states formed to begin with? Largely to protect groups of people, and then larger and larger groups against others. And it's a fundamental responsibility of the state. And the ISIS panel, the Canadian panel that Emyr referred to, in some ways combined these, but I think in many ways the very term responsibility to protect comes from sovereignty as responsibility. And I think it's worth thinking of that. We're trying to lay out now for the Secretary General and hopefully for the UN member states what the conception is of R2P at this point, at least from a UN viewpoint, and trying to take the words of the outcome document from 2005, giving them some content, giving them some substance, and hopefully over time some operational identity and capacity as well. And what we have been arguing, and I think the Secretary General before long is going to make a major statement laying these things out, but basically Responsibility to Protect rests not on two pillars like humanitarian intervention, but really three. The first and the fundamental one is obviously the state responsibility, and that remains and is very well grounded in international law. Obviously, genocide has a very specific convention and meaning. The question of war crimes, again, is very well founded in international law. The question of ethnic cleansing is sort of getting there, but is not quite at the same status. And crimes against humanity does not have a single convention, but is quite well developed international case law and individual situations. So I think in many ways it's becoming really a common law notion. So the first pillar is very well rooted in international law and practice, and I think also in terms of political support. But the second pillar, which Emyr alluded to, but I think deserves much more emphasis, is this responsibility, a parallel and concomitant responsibility of the international community to help and assist the state to meet these fundamental obligations. Now, there will be cases where particular regimes are so bloody-minded towards one portion of the population, their territory, or another, and so resistant to outside assistance that one can't move it very much. But if you look historically, even over the last 20 years, the incident of genocide has gone down remarkably over that period. We hope we can keep it in that direction. And you look at many cases, why did Rwanda go to a horrific genocide in 1994, and next door in Burundi, which had itself quite a long history of genocide reoccurring, did not. Very similar ethnic composition, similar strains, and several things seem to be in place, some domestically within Burundi, a lot having to do with the neighborhood and other countries in Africa getting involved. and a lot of sort of friendly international intervention in that particular situation. We think it's very important to look very seriously in terms of capacity building within states, in terms of prevention. Are there things that the international community in a positive way can do with states and together with regional and sub-regional organizations to help meet this second pillar, so we don't get to the tough choices of intervention. And then only if all this fails do you get to that third pillar, which is what kinds of more coercive responses might the international community be thinking of. And we don't assume that these are all necessarily military in character. There's going to be relatively few situations, one, where you can get agreement in the Council on that sort of action and these kinds of cases. And second of all, that the organization is not particularly adept at coercive intervention. And that in some cases you might have a combination of a civilian and military response in some of these cases. But it seems very important that you move very early and you not wait until it's too late. I mean, to me personally, it's morally repugnant to think that you wait until there's hundreds of thousands of dead and then you decide, do you intervene or not militarily? That's not either politically or operationally, or I think morally, a satisfactory way to think about this. Rather, we have to think of this much more as a continuum. Second of all, I think it's worth thinking about, quite frankly, whether the doctrine of responsibility to protect would have made a difference in terms of Kosovo. It's not clear to me whether it would have or would not have. There probably, of the 4 crimes and violations, one could have made an argument probably on ethnic cleansing. The others, I think, would have been a good deal weaker. And now historians are very much debating whether the threat was exaggerated or not, and really, how great was the violence. It was certainly repugnant, but would it have triggered an R2P kind of response? My guess is that having the doctrine would not have made a big difference, but it's worth contemplating that. Third, on the politics, let me say a couple of things. One, I think it's worth remembering as important, and Emyr played himself a very important role in pushing certain large states that he referred to over the edge to accept this. He sort of embarrassed them into it, I think. And the Canadian leadership was very important in all of this. But nothing gets accomplished in the General Assembly, and a World Summit is basically a General Assembly writ large at a somewhat higher level. Nothing happens because Western countries think it's important. It only happens if you have, in fact, solid support from parts of the developing world. I mean, the numbers simply dictate that. And I think people forget that, in fact, Africa and the African Union were way ahead of the international community. When the AU was founded in 2000, you look at the Constitutive Act for the AU, I think it's Article 4H, and it has, in fact, a prescription for responsibility to protect, slightly different words, which in many ways is bolder than what the UN came up with 5 years later in the outcome document. And it doesn't have as many caveats to it. So it seems to me that the African support was very important at that time, and we should remind people that this is not some kind of a northern doctrine pushed down the throats of the South, but in fact there were important countries and regions in the South that actually had some sympathy for this. Now, politically, what has happened since 2005? Unfortunately, there's been a lot of backsliding on this. Kofi Annan gets a lot of credit for his bold words, but quite frankly, nothing was done to follow up on this. It was a historic breakthrough that these 2 paragraphs, 138 and 139, were adopted in the outcome document. There was no program of action following it. There was no effort to hire anyone to do anything. There were no UN plans or contingency planning that was done at all on this. It was just sort of left there in many ways to sit. And, he had other things to worry about, and member states had other things to worry about. And so I think really one has to give some credit to the current Secretary General, who may not be a media all-star. He may not be the most eloquent person one has ever heard. He may not be someone who is ever going to have to worry about a cult of personality. But he does plug away at things, and he does care about certain things and cares about them a lot. And when he was running to be Secretary General, he was the one candidate who put a lot of stress on Responsibility to Protect. And he kept using the phrase that he wants to operationalize this. Because I think his feeling, as I'm sure many people here would share, and very much my feeling, is that an organization that's very good at proclaiming bold ideas and does very little to implement them is a rather hollow organization. And that in many ways the credibility of the institution has suffered again and again because it's so good at raising norms and so mediocre and so uneven at implementing them. So I think he wanted, this is my interpretation, that he did not want to have a Srebrenica, he did not want to have a Rwanda on his watch, and has been quite determined to move forward on this. Now, how does one do this? It's not intuitively obvious, which made it, to me, think like an interesting thing to work on. And I'm supposed to be working on 3 things. One is to get conceptual coherence, so that we have not only the member states hopefully embrace the concept in a little more detail than did in the past, but even have the Secretariat, with all of its far-flung outposts, actually agree on what they're talking about. Because until fairly recently, if you're sitting in Geneva doing human rights, or you're sitting in New York doing humanitarian affairs or peacekeeping or political affairs, or you're running a particular agency, or Office of Legal Affairs, they were all over the lot. Everyone had a different view of what R2P was. So the first thing we're supposed to do is to work across the system to try to get a common conception. And I think we have that now, and I think we have agreement on that. And I think that will be reflected before long in a major statement by the Secretary General. Second of all, it was to try to facilitate the creation of some instruments of some sort within the organization itself to help operationalize this doctrine. And needless to say, while it's hard to get everyone to agree on concepts, it's even harder to get them to agree on any bureaucratic entity. Turf comes up right, left, and center, and we're still working that through. But I think some pieces are pretty clear and pretty obvious. If you're going to do prevention and to get the member states to sign on, it's got to be very heavy on prevention. You need early warning. And if you have early warning, you need some kind of an assessment, and someone has to do that. The UN doesn't lack for capacity on the ground to gather information. There are now easily 1,000 people from the Office of the High Commissioner in Human Rights alone around the world gathering information on what's going on in human rights situations. You have another 1,000 or so from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, looking at humanitarian efforts on the ground. You have more peacekeepers in more countries than ever before. You have more people from the Department of Political Affairs and political missions around the world than ever before. You have more civil society groups to call on who are gathering very often very good information on what's going on. The problem, of course, typical of the organization, is that none of these streams talk to each other. So they each have their own assessment, and it seems to us that what is really important is that you see the patterns that are developing in certain countries and see how the pieces fit together. So how one does that is sort of what we're working through, as well as how one begins to think about what the outcome document called a timely and decisive response. They're all allergic to the word rapid response. It sounds too military, but timely and effective response. Now, many people say that because of Darfur, this is proof that R2P doesn't work. We like to point out to people that the violence in Darfur started 3 years before the outcome document even accepted the terminology of R2P, and obviously long before the organization actually organizes itself to deal with this. We like to think that the first real test for R2P was Kenya. It didn't get a lot of publicity, partly because it went well. But there was a problem. The UN was involved in many ways after the elections in Kenya and after the violence. but they weren't well coordinated, if I may say that. And the right hand didn't always know what the left hand was doing, and there was no overarching strategy. So some of us suggested at the time that maybe that overarching strategy, in fact, should be the responsibility to protect. You either had ethnic cleansing or something that was beginning to look a lot like ethnic cleansing, and that, in fact, other things might have over time, even worse disasters been triggered. And the Secretary General liked this. Not everyone in the bureaucracy did. And in fact, when he went then to the African Union Summit, he talked about the responsibility to protect and talked about Kenya being a test case for it. When he went into Kenya, he talked to the leadership, both in the opposition and the president, about R2P and their responsibilities. Kofi Annan picked it up in his weeks and weeks of mediation there. Kofi Annan says this is the first test case of R2P, and that was the terminology he used. When the Secretary General came back to the Security Council, again, he said this was R2P, et cetera, and he said several other states used the same terminology, and no one objected. So when you're trying to sell this politically to the member states, you want them to have images of situations where it's applied, where in fact it's not a question of military intervention or not, but rather assisting the state, which is in some trouble, to sort out these difficulties and to have it really as an organizing principle and a way of thinking about what we're doing and to provide some overall objectives to the effort. I assume there'd be some questions about Myanmar. Needless to say, this is at the time very controversial around the organization and whether R2P does or does not apply. I have been arguing that it does not. That might change over time depending on what happens there, but that is not the best way to approach that particular situation. And I'm quite confident that the large majority of member states see it the same way. One P5 member in particular sees it quite differently, and we'll see how the others come out. So we know a bit about R2P in theory. What we don't know very much about is R2P in practice, and that I hope we'll see unfolding in the next few years. I'd have to say that the politics are still very, very tough. The non-aligned countries in particular are not wildly enthusiastic about this. They seem to rather like the way that we're approaching it because it's so broad-based, and they like the fact that we're actually talking to them about it. But with some of the statements in the Security Council and outside in recent days about Myanmar, a lot of them have been running quite the other way. So we have to see if we can put the pieces back together again. Just finally, let me say, while this is not an easy task to move forward, I'm reassured for two reasons. One, because the Secretary General remains so enthusiastic. He is the chief advocate for this within the organization. And second of all, is it seems to me that history is very much on our side. As unhappy as we are when we see what's happening in Darfur, if you compare that to Rwanda back in 1994, there is at least a much greater and many layered response. It's been very hard to put the pieces back together, but no one is saying it's not serious. Many, including the U.S., finally are admitting that they see genocide when they denied in '94 that it was occurring in Rwanda. And I think the costs for casting a veto in the Security Council in a case that appears to be unfolding genocide has gotten politically to be very high, partly because of all the transnational civil society groups that are so concerned and so involved with these issues. And when we go out to capitals, we find the attitudes, even in many non-aligned countries, are far better and more practical to this in capitals than they are in New York. Because in New York we have the great privilege of the North-South divide and all the politics that come along with it. And in fact, we've had several cases where we're getting rather negative response in New York, and then all of a sudden the capitals intervene or the foreign ministers intervene or whatever, and help to get a more positive spin on it. So I like to think that history is on our side. I guess we'll find out over time. But that should be enough at least to get the conversation started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. The history goes on for a long time, as it has. I've got a number of questions, but I'm going to hold back and open it up for all of you. Think for a few moments about the issues. And anybody has a quick question? Yes.
Yeah, quick question. You said there are non-aligned countries. So I'm curious. I don't know how many there are, but who's not aligned, and why? What are the motivations for being non-aligned?
And do we still use that phrase, by the way? Non-aligned with whom?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's some of us on the political science side decided that the NAM movement was dead some time ago. If you spend time in New York, it seems pretty lively. And currently, NAM is chaired by Cuba. The former chair was Malaysia, and the future chair is Egypt. So this is a leadership troika. So as an American working this issue
unholy
in
trinity.
New York, it's a fairly entertaining group. But I mean, there are big differences within NAM. I guess it's 135 countries or something like that now, out of the 192. It's 130 something. Obviously, with that many states, they're not cohesive on everything. But it makes sometimes a rather big barrier to overcome. And there's a few big non-aligned states, particularly in South Asia, that are particularly difficult on this issue and have their own sort of perspective on sovereignty-related issues. And much of this gets tied up with their attitudes towards the Security Council and towards Security Council reform. You know, if they were a member of the Security Council and a permanent member in particular, then maybe this would be okay. But since they're not, you know, with these former colonial powers and whatever on the council, you know, they're a little less enthusiastic.
You want to add something, Emyr?
Well, I was just going to say, as a former colonial power, I'll tell you what I lack in this delightful town of Hanover. I've said to some colleagues,
Could you please use your microphone?
Are you sure you
try
want to
and
hear
use it
him?
with pleasure. In the European Union, if a project is funded by the European Union, there's a sign outside that says, "This is brought to you by the kindness of the European Union." And I'd like a sign outside Hanover to say, "This heaven in New England is brought to you by courtesy of the British."
You leave it at that.
No, I'm not going to leave it like that. I'm not quite as sanguine as Professor Luck. And I'll tell you why. Because he said it out and said, well, people are increasingly moving towards accepting this. They're only accepting it because they regard it as non-threatening in the way it's presented. To be clear, the UN doesn't do implementation. It passes statements in world outcome documents. Neither he nor I are surprised that the UN didn't follow it up. Of course it didn't. It doesn't follow up most things. It doesn't do, for example, conflict prevention. We don't attack conflict before it's breaking out. But specifically, what I want to say to Ed is, if you're going to, as the world outcome document said, confine all this to genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and if you're going to say it's only a last resort, but we might intervene militarily to tackle those problems, by the time you actually define those problems as existing, the deaths have mostly occurred. I don't say that in a trite fashion. He claims that the first test is actually Kenya. Well, I think there are lots of other tests out there. I think there's a test in Darfur. I tried very hard to get Security Council consideration of Darfur and of Sudan, and eventually we started passing resolutions on Sudan and even later on referring to Darfur. But the hard fact of life was that the key resolution adopted in the summer of 2006, which would have put peacekeepers on the ground, required the consent of the government in Khartoum. And they said no. And the deaths continued. And the stark dilemma of state sovereignty, what the state's willing to put up with, against the wishes of the Security Council, comes into sharp focus. And the fact is, if we, the British, had drafted our resolution to say that whatever the Sudanese government think, we are going to put peacekeepers on the ground, there would have been vetoes, and had we passed the resolution, troops would not have gone, so we'd have been stuck. The dilemma is still there. And frankly, if you are dying, whether it's from genocide or from neglect by the member state, frankly, it doesn't matter much to the person who's about to die. Darfur, I think, comes in this category. I think Zimbabwe comes into it as a racing certainty. The international community should have the balls to intervene, and it doesn't. And the locals ought to intervene, and they don't. And one state in particular will bear a very heavy responsibility in history for what it's allowing to happen. And Myanmar, there may not be a responsibility to protect, but there is a government which the neighbors and which the General Assembly majority have condoned its behavior for 50-something years, and it has blighted a country and its people. And now, when the most awful calamity occurs, and of course it's not the government's fault, but the neglect subsequently coming on top of all the oppression, that's what that government is imposing on its people. And the main news item is that last Wednesday, the junta had sent a message of congratulations to the new president of Russia. That's the main news item. And then last weekend, they put all their resources into a referendum on some false constitutional change to justify the status of that junta. And the rest of us said nothing. Now, I regard responsibility to protect the responsibility of governments as affecting all those three countries. I've chastised the president of Sudan. I would love to have had the same opportunity with the other two heads of government. But the fact is, their governments are not doing what they should do. The international community, even in the benign second category, isn't. And none of us are prepared to do the third, which we ought if we're going to save the lives. That's the reality of what's happening in countries. And so we talk about, well, will G77, a misnomer because it's 133 countries, and the non-aligned movement, which is 130-something, with a slightly different membership at the margin. But the big beasts, and you heard three of them, the Troika. The Cubans, would they ever support anybody intervening? Well, they intervened in Angola, fine, 30 years ago. But would they intervene today to stop people dying? Would the Malaysians stand up and be counted? And would the Egyptians ever give force to any of this? Even though, of course, they're signatories of what the African Union agreed 10 years ago, and I agree with Ed, it was very forward. But it hasn't actually permitted the African Union to do as much as I would like it to do, although I have to pay credit to what it is doing and what it's done, especially in Darfur, and is trying to do in Somalia. But the fact is, we can't, in my view, be quite so complacent about it as an international community, because all the time people are dying and we're not prepared to act. I hope you heard that, madam.
Yes, it was worth hearing. And let me just pose a question. In the Kosovo case, the authorization to intervene was made by NATO, not by the UN.
No, NATO didn't authorize it. NATO did it. That's the difference. And let me come back to Professor Luck as well. Was it justified? Right. Let me just say that in July 1998, I had the privilege as part of the European Union Troika to go to Belgrade to see the foreign minister for a very tedious 6-hour defense of what they were doing, and then the next day to go to Pristina. And from Pristina, I set off with the British defense attaché leading us because he could talk his way through the military roadblocks, and we pitched up in a little town called Obrobica, I think it was. Population about the size of Hanover. And on the way, there was not a single field of crops which was not burnt. And 3 days before, they had all been ready for harvest. There wasn't a single building that I saw which didn't have one strategic shell straight through it. And there wasn't a single person left in Obrobica apart from the Serb military. And the rest had been driven out. And that systematic abuse of its own people, what I said to Milosevic the next day, I gave him the coordinates of where his own villages were being shelled by his own military. That's what was happening in July 1998. And after a long, drawn-out negotiation, which would have provided a political solution, Milosevic rejected it. And against the measure of what had taken place in the Balkans, the test was, were we going to allow it to happen again, or were we prepared to intervene? That's why I think we were justified, why I have not the slightest scruples about being part of that entire process before and afterwards. Because was it really responsibility to protect? Well, I know how I spent my Easter Saturday in 1999. I spent it trying to find a solution to 100,000 Kosovars who had been put on trains and shunted to the Macedonian border, and the Macedonians would not let them in. It was the best example to actually produce in the European Union the willingness to continue the action because they saw what this guy was doing. That's why it happened, and that's why, just for once, the international community, I think, did the right thing.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question to Mr. Ambassador. First, I would like to say that probably all Kosovar people are really grateful to your personal contribution in stopping the genocide in Kosovo. I'm very sure about that. My second is regarding Kosovo statehood. You mentioned it in the beginning of your talk that Kosovo is within Serbia, but to what extent could we say that when we see Kosovo has its own constitution right now, it has its own president and parliament, the US, your country, and also the G7 countries have transformed their diplomatic offices into embassies. Meanwhile, Kosovo is opening their own embassies. America and other countries are helping Kosovo to build its own military force. And last week, the United Nations mission in Kosovo considered the local elections held in Serbian enclaves by Serbia as illegal, meaning that United Nations mission in Kosovo will not cooperate with parallel structures organized by the Serbian government within Kosovo. So what makes Kosovo within Serbia when we have all these conditions except the fact that Kosovo does not have a seat in the UN? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I had not realized you were again with me today, and my remarks were not targeted at you.
Being shadowed.
1244, the resolution of the Security Council, talks about the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia and Montenegro in the context of Kosovo. And Montenegro has gone its own way, and I think the logic is unassailable that Kosovo lies within what is called the territory of Serbia. I think it follows as night follows day. All the actions you described don't make the territory different. But we are dealing with the complicated issue of secession, and on what basis can there be secession, and on what basis can the international community recognize that territory as being independent and a distinct state. And I think the test is that sufficient number of countries, and it's got to be in 3 figures, I think, have to recognize that independence, and then you're entitled, I think, to ask the Security Council to recommend to the General Assembly that you become a member of the United Nations, and as such, enjoy the benefits of full statehood. At the moment, you're moving towards that, but you're not going to get, for example, grants from the international financial institutions precisely because you don't have the UN membership. You're what I described as in limbo. Well, it's in limbo moving towards statehood, but there are conditions which need to be fulfilled before you get there. And of course, there's the problem of what on earth is Russia and some of its allies going to do in regard to that. But it's not just Russia. When this came up in the Security Council, South Africa, for example, took a very strong stance about territorial integrity. It's not an accident that when the Organization of African Union was set up in 1960, the first decision they made was to recognize all boundaries, borders, and to argue that no state should be changed. However illogical many of those state boundaries were, because they realized the carnage that would ensue if they opened Pandora's box and started changing. So the politics and the legality of secession are pretty complex.
Yeah.
We were in northern Greece at Christmas time interviewing young people, mostly students from Kosovo. And the unemployment rate there apparently is almost up to 90%. So we have a sovereign state, but one that's sunk in poverty. We wonder how that can continue. The second remark I have here to make, and I perhaps misunderstood Edward Luck, in that he said we have history on our side. You weren't talking about the Balkans, certainly.
The question is, do we have history on our side? What did you mean by that?
What exactly? Could
Yeah,
you
let me,
define that?
yeah, if I could comment on that, and also to get back to my friend Emyr, she's been waiting for it.
I thought it'd been quiet too long.
Yeah. If you look at the degree of international concern, whether it's public, governmental, non-governmental groups, whatever, about these kinds of issues, I don't know how you would measure it, but I'm quite confident that has gone up a great deal over time. I mean, certainly during the Cold War era, people didn't pay attention to these things because it wasn't important. It was all east-west and strategic, this, that, and the other thing. And I think even since the early 90s, with some of the atrocities that occurred, including in the Balkans, the determination to find some way to handle these things, I think, has gone up remarkably. And if I'm sanguine, it's only over a long historical period that I think we're moving in a particular direction. And I think Emyr's comments about R2P would have been said and were said by many, many people in the 50s and 60s and 70s about human rights. And why you're sort of wasting your time, it doesn't make any difference, and you got the Soviets, this, that, and the other thing. And it turns out it had enormous force in eroding the Soviet empire and its very legitimacy. And it seems to me, being a bit of a constructivist in terms of international relations theory, that values matter enormously. That their national interest is largely defined by what you think your values and priorities are. It's not a given in any sense. And that, in fact, values in this regard have changed immensely. So it's not that, the Balkans are it's a love fest now. But, it is being addressed in a very serious and unfortunately very expensive and very time-consuming way over time. But I think the very fact that there is so much focus on, for example, what's going on in Darfur is a very encouraging sign. Now, to say, gee, there are a lot of tragedies in the world going on, therefore, what is the choice? Do we give up? No. We try to deal with them, and we have to deal with them piece by piece, incrementally, and it takes a great deal of time. And at any point in time, you can point and say, oh my God, the organization's not doing this, we can't handle this problem, we can't handle that problem. But if you look over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and Emyr and I both remember Westphalia. We were there, weren't we, Emyr? You do see enormous change in these things. You see a change in attitudes. You see a change in what people even try to do. You look at the Security Council's agenda and the amount they deal now with protection of civilians in armed conflict, the amount they deal with thematic issues, the amount they try to deal with prevention. And I do think some of the efforts in prevention actually have made some difference. And, depending on whether you believe the Uppsala numbers and others, if you look at the number of wars between states, they've gone down dramatically since the early 90s. You even look at the number of wars within states, they've gone down, not as dramatically. You look at the number of casualties, they've gone down. You look at the number of refugees, they've gone down. Internally displaced people remains fairly high, and terrorism remains a problem, and there are parts of the world where, nothing seems to be going right. But it does seem to me in the aggregate, all the efforts about international law and international organization and conciliation and this, that, and the other thing and development do make a difference. And so I think it depends very much if you look at the problems of the moment, or do you say, okay, 10 years ago, would we even been talking about those problems or been concerned about them, or 20 years ago? Did we have any mechanisms? Was there any response? And to me, the trend is very clear that the world is trying to come to grips with these things. I'm not sanguine in the short run at all. I think the only way you can deal with an organization like the UN is a lot of idealism, a lot of cynicism, in about a 50-50 mix. If you're not hard-nosed and cynical and realistic about politics, you shouldn't spend your time there. But if you don't have any ideals and sense of purpose and principle, you shouldn't be there either. And I think the same things that, in a sense, I don't mean to caricature, but the same sort of thing you're saying about R2P, one could say about the UN Charter. You know, the UN Charter starts these grand principles, these grand purposes, and then it gives us a very hard-nosed, power-based decision-making process. And quite frankly, you know, you're talking about the Russians in Kosovo, this, that, and the other thing. I think your argument's exactly why we have to take this other approach to R2P. If you put all the eggs in the Security Council responding by military force basket, very rarely is there going to be sufficient will to do that. Therefore, you have to do these other things, not only because you're soft-headed, but because that's the only realistic way to go about it. And you have to build these things step by step by step. You'll remember, as I do, in the early 90s when the UN got heavily into humanitarian affairs, this, that, and the other thing. It's the same bureaucratic problems, many of the same kinds of political problems, and it's become a major effort of what it and much of the non-governmental community does. It makes a big difference. Same thing when they're creating a High Commissioner for Human Rights and what a waste and this, that, and the other thing. The same thing. It takes time for these things to take hold. And, you know, to me, the best approach is not simply to have grand declarations and we're going to respond in a way that's going to solve all these things, but rather we're going to be very modest about it. Take it inch by inch, step by step, and begin to build, first, an acceptance among the member states. And if we take the maximal approach to this, we'll never have acceptance by the member states. And it's always, since these are UN decisions and UN bodies, it's got to be within the Charter. And so the Kosovo response is not going to be permitted because there's not going to be a Security Council decision. And so, you know, I think it's terrific that people from the outside and other groups and maybe even regional, sub-regional groups are talking about different kinds of responses and sometimes will respond differently. But the UN, you do have a charter, you do have intergovernmental bodies, you do have certain purposes and decision-making processes you have to respect. And when you do that, it does limit. You know, everyone gets up and makes grand speeches about these things, but not many member states either have the will or, frankly, the wherewithal to respond militarily to these kinds of situations, including the United States and including, unfortunately, the UK, and including France and others are talking about much tougher measures in Myanmar. What tough measures? You know, pass declarations, maybe impose sanctions. Is any of that going to help the people? Is any of that going to get the aid there more quickly? Is it going to convince the regime to open up? Maybe, but maybe a paranoid regime is going to have quite the opposite reaction. And maybe, you know, constant sort of political pressure and diplomatic pressure, particularly from the neighbors, you know, maybe it's only opening inch by inch by inch, but maybe that's better than not opening at all, and certainly is better than making it a military confrontation where the few resources they have are all of a sudden go back fully to national security instead of trying to meet this. So, you know, I think great big talk is terrific, but then what kind of capacity do we really have to move beyond the big talk?
Yes, sir.
I'm puzzled and even startled by the continued use of the phrase ethnic cleansing. Who becomes cleaner? And what is there a formal difference between, say, ethnic cleansing and genocide?
Is there a difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide?
You want to start, Emyr, now?
Yes. There is a definition of genocide.
I mean, genocide is set out in the Genocide Convention, and you have to meet different criteria. And part of the problem with it, by the time you've established whether the criteria are being met, is people have died. Ethnic cleansing, put simply, however one thinks of the term, it means trying to remove all but one particular ethnic group from a given territory. And sadly, that still exists. I mean, I think Ed has just given a very strong defense of the politics of the possible and why we are where we are. And I have always been a pragmatist. I agree with a lot of that. The problem, though, is that how many years beyond Westphalia, the same number of years will have to occur in the future before we ever get to a stage where we've made sufficient progress that there might, on this argument, be a willingness to approve the right sort of action. And people are going to die in their old age in Burma who've known nothing other than oppression and the international community failed. Ed said you could take sanctions. The European Union took sanctions against that regime many years ago. The tragedy is that that didn't work, but ASEAN countries as neighbors, talking to them gently in an Asian way, hasn't made the slightest difference either. I tell you, I would be very, without going into the merits of whether it's responsibility to protect, and I tend to agree with Ed's argument, I'd be very tempted to put down a Security Council resolution on Myanmar authorizing the dispatch and delivery of humanitarian aid and necessary measures to protect the people delivering it. And I'd shame whoever it was in the council actually to veto that resolution. But at least we'd know where responsibilities were. And then I'd say to the government, along with ASEAN countries, this is what the international community has authorized, this is what we're prepared to do. Now, are you going to stand in the way or not? And I'd try and face down the regime. But at least I'd have a sense that something was being done. But meanwhile, the death toll is high, and if you notice, it doesn't even get a space in newspapers in this country anymore. The Chinese earthquake has taken over, and you may get a couple of lines. But what's going to happen is that the second order consequence will actually be the absence of water and food will mean cholera and all the other diseases, and they'll die in their hundreds of thousands. And meanwhile, as happened to the European Union Commissioner for Aid, who in Rangoon yesterday was taken to see an immaculate camp with lots of well-looked after people, who I'm sure have absolutely nothing to do with the cyclone. But that's the presentation by that regime, and that's the plight of the people. So without wanting to prejudice responsibility to protect, because I understand the argument, there isn't, as I said at the beginning, I think more than 40% in favor of it, and even there, those of little faith will actually leave it. But actually, on humanitarian grounds, and what has happened in every other humanitarian crisis is that international assistance has been accepted. It takes a very special sort of regime to turn yourself away from it.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah, another one.
About Fyrom, about the former Yugoslav Republic. Is that a danger that Macedonia, is it an irredentist danger that Macedonia has taken that name and looked at it especially from a historical point of view?
Well, it's a funny coincidence that the President of the General Assembly this year is from Fyrom. He's from Macedonia. The President of the General Assembly this particular year.
That gives him an edge.
I'm not an expert on Macedonia. I was there earlier this year. Been there a few times, but I'm not sure it's as big a problem as some of our Greek friends say that it is. It is a divided community in some ways. It does obviously have potential. But it's also a place where it seems to me where the international community was able to make some difference in terms of intervening, in terms of political mediation, in terms of helping and put pieces together. But whether it's going to be a trouble spot in the future, I think it's one of those things you have to bear rather close watching.
If one takes a name for one's country.
I'm not sure the name's the problem.
Yeah.
It may be for the neighbors, but I think for the people, there's other kinds of divisions, religious divisions and others. But I'm not an expert in Macedonia, but I know Emyr's an expert in Macedonia.
I'm not sure whether he's being facetious or whether he's just passing the parcel, but Macedonia, Fyrom, demonstrates a number of things. One is the lack of wisdom of its government, which around about 1998-ish did a deal with Taiwan, actually looking for inward investment, and there was a sizable sum of money involved. So Macedonia, I'll call it that second time round, recognized Taiwan. So the United Nations peacekeeping force on the border with Kosovo, when it came up for renewal, the Chinese vetoed it. So there was no UN presence on the ground. That tells you something about Chinese capacity to look where its interests are and to respect values and other things. Now, in 2001, Macedonia, Fyrom, came very, very close to civil war. There are 32%, I think it is, Albanians, ethnic Albanians in Fyrom, and it took the combined weight of the European Union, NATO, and the OSCE to avert a crisis. So very effective conflict prevention, lots of action, mediation by the Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana from the European Union, and the Foreign Minister of Romania. Net result was Fyrom is more or less stable. It's had a number of elections since, and some very unscrupulous characters happily are no longer in government. Now move to the Bucharest NATO summit earlier this year, and Fyrom should have been admitted as a member of NATO. Fyrom was not admitted as a member of NATO because there is no agreement on the name, and Greece vetoed its membership. Now, Fyrom, Macedonia, given the instability, given where it's come from and what it's achieved, I go as far as to say its key role in regional stability, and the fact that the country probably with as much interest in its stability as anybody else is Greece, because there are about 500,000 refugees from Albania, similar number I think, from Macedonia in northern Greece. Greece still, because of his name, vetoed. Draw your own conclusions from that. But what's clear is, I think, that whatever they accepted as a government, and whichever government in Athens accepted it, if it has the words Macedonia without qualification, the Greek parliament of any persuasion will reject it, and the government of the day will fall. That's the extent of the issue. It has all to do with the name, Philip of Macedon, and various crosses of Philip, and I'm not sure exactly what there is about the insignia, but it's very sensitive. But it is an example where since 1992, no good sense has prevailed. There's been no agreement on the name, and the name does, as we see, then take us to decisions which cannot be defended, and which, if there are any good sense, they, between them, find agreement on the name, because it's in all our interests that the Balkans are all stable, and we can do without deliberate, stupid instability.
Yeah,
Well,
if I might
go ahead,
say one more thing about although I agree very much with what Emyr said. I mean, one's impression, and from what I've seen, although I'm not an expert in Macedonia, is the economy seems to be doing quite well. And that sometimes can be a unifying factor, if in fact it helps, both sides of the divide ethnically. And it looks and feels like a fairly stable, progressive society at this point in time. We just hope it keeps there.
Millions and millions of dollars in that.
Well, it's a little like China and Taiwan, Yeah.
I
problems don't necessarily
I
stop
see it's
investment.
6 o'clock, and I know you have to get away. So I'm going to call this to a halt and just say, for one, our friend who was the permanent representative of the UK to the UN has left diplomacy, and I hope not entirely. He is now the president of the University of Wales. So welcome to academia. I hope you're not lost to diplomacy. And as far as Ed Luck goes, Dartmouth produces some pretty good people, we think.
Well,